If you look anywhere on my movie shelf, the most apparent pattern that you'll notice about my taste is that I love films that have big, vibrant, well-defined, and often self-contained worlds. Blade Runner, Brazil, Gilda, Willy Wonka, the 90s Batmans, Dick Tracy, a lot of film noir in general. I love Hammer and Amicus horror, Bram Stoker's Dracula. I like high concept. And that's why, ever since it came out, I could never really put a finger on why Dark City doesn't scratch that itch as well, or why it never ended up being one of my favorites, even though aesthetically it absolutely should. It's an oddball stylistic mashup of a kind of future noir alien abduction that heavily features a German expressionist made-from-scratch world that was ripe to be an instant cult classic for someone like me, but just never ended up being one. Even crapfests like Howard the Duck still hold enough charm for me based solely on the world it creates, on mostly just the visual creativity and weirdness. Buckaroo Banzai is another example. I really admire it and I'm glad it exists, despite the fact that I find most of it incredibly boring to actually watch. So why doesn't Dark City do it for me? I think that because it came out so close before The Matrix that it has this natural Mandela effect, where the first few times I rewatched it, I just assumed that the alien stuff was a surprise later in the movie, and that was a major component, and that twist was a major component of the film. And so I'm always taken aback by how it immediately just throws everything in your lap. And whether or not you're watching the director's cut, 5 minutes into the movie, we already know that someone is meddling with John Murdoch's life. He's getting flashbacks, a weird phone call, and the freaky pale dude show up. Nothing has any time to bake. We don't get a baseline of what normal is for John or the people of this city. 13 minutes in and we learn that he has powers. So even in the director's cut, the mystery or any building suspense is essentially undercut at this point. 20 minutes into the film, and again, what should be a revelation is kind of arbitrarily thrown in the viewer's laps. There are aliens, and they're experimenting on people who think they're living in the real world. Less than a third of the way through already feels like what should be the climax. There are way too many questions and answers for this early in the film. Maybe you're supposed to take John as a kind of superpowered fish out of water and gauge the mystery aspect based on the supporting characters' reactions to the situation. But even then, Emma, Jennifer Connelly's character, just kind of wanders around in an aloof state, like she's always kind of known on some level what's going on. In fact, she acts in a way that I think would have been more interesting, that would have made for a more interesting lead. William Hurt's character, Frank, has a bit of a meltdown, and we learn some about his perceived life, but neither of them go through enough development to add any compelling depth to what we already know. They act generally lost and are almost exclusively concerned with John's actions and behaviors, which would be okay if John was more compelling, but also none of the side characters branch off into self-goals or attain much autonomy, which leads to a deeper, more difficult to pin down problem of how much autonomy do the people of Dark City have, and what would liberation from this place even mean to them? It's not a crippling issue, but it's glossed over enough that its vacancy lingers throughout the background of this film. The strangers don't add much to this equation either. All we know is that they think the key to their survival is the human soul, and the only insight into how they feel beyond general anxiety and frustration is a little summary conversation John has with Mr. Hand at the end of the film, after he's injected himself with John's memories. So the movie can't really be treated as a philosophical investigation into any character behavior, the human condition, the experiences in this bizarre world, or potentially where they'll go next. It just seems to be about the scenario in general, which the filmmakers seem to think was enough to sustain itself. It seems like it wants to be a statement on the nature of memory and how emotions interact with them, but again, the film only nominally points in that general direction. Dark City's transparency with its plot almost feels like a subversion in and of itself. There's no mystery, either like a straightforward film noir, how did I get here sort of thing, which the film carries out the pretense of only for a little while, or a Groundhog Day rearranging of John's life as he slowly begins to feel the deja vu get more intense. The premise practically begs for this avenue to be explored. It is the setup. It is the mystery, but it's immediately dropped. Why? If it was just going to glide past any potential surprise, then at the bare minimum, it could have had a generic twist ending where it all turned out to be a psychosis of the main character, that he was the killer the whole time, something like Terry Gilliam's Brazil. That would have at least been something. The Walensky subplot regarding William Hurt's former partner's descent into madness probably should have been at the start of the film, before we ever meet John, or just cut out. The movie also probably should have started off as a traditional, standard noir detective procedural, following William Hurt and John simultaneously as John keeps waking up at the murders he thinks he's committed. Let that cook for a lot longer than it does, and then sprinkle in the questions as it goes, with a few answers leading to bigger reveals in the final third. It's also not like the movie needs to hurry past all of this stuff, to speed through the slow burn setup to get to action, because there's hardly any of that either. And yet the concept and the aesthetic do so much of the heavy lifting that it feels like it could or should have been the framework for a more action-oriented movie like a Total Recall, The Crow, or of course The Matrix. But that element never takes priority over the atmosphere. The action spectacle never really draws much attention to itself, and so to me most of the runtime comes across like a fairly dull game of hide-and-seek between John and the strangers. We're just kind of following him around as he sees firsthand how the sausage is made. Except we've already been told and shown how the sausage is made, so it's just not that interesting. It's at this later point that Dark City really needed an actual heady, subversive twist, a third layer to the basic premises. I guess the they're on a spaceship reveal is kind of cool, but with the bad guys looking like freaky undead weirdos, and the fact that we already know they're not human and clearly not living in a realistic setting, the options for surprise are pretty limited. If they're not space aliens, then what potentially else could they be? Ghosts, vampires, maybe something outside of John's consciousness could have been more interesting, like he escapes the boundaries of Dark City and enters another realm of existence. Knowing that aliens are the culprits so early in the film severely undercuts the human drama and turns the focus mostly to schlock concept, action sci-fi that forms a mixed bag of tone which seems really tepid about how it wants to engage with the audience, or what part of the viewer it wants to appeal to. Besides the obvious noir influence, the vibe of Dark City seems to be closest to that of a fairy tale. Unlike a lot of its genre neighbors, Dark City steers almost entirely clear of any cynicism or irony, and it insists to the viewer that the protagonist, simply by virtue of traversing through this high-concept predicament, is compelling. The only real thrust of the story is in the two questions it presents. Where and why is Shell Beach? And will John's love for Emma transcend alien interference? It's a bit of a dime store novel sitting precariously on an introspective noir mystery romance. And to me, it doesn't go far enough or deep enough into the rabbit hole to really solidify the dreamlike nature that I assume it was aiming for at the center of all these influences. Going back specifically to aesthetics, style, and world building, why do I find The Crow, which is basically Dark City's older sibling, so much more engaging than this film? There's a lot in the art design of Dark City that I really, really like. I love the automat and the aquarium. It's all quite beautiful in its minimalist, nondescript 1940s urban skeleton dotted with small alcoves of neon deco. But it all feels empty. I understand that that was part of the intention. It's supposed to feel like a lonely, artificial world, but what is the function of these environments? Very few of the spaces feel lived in. Regardless of how false the in-world city is meant to be, it still needs some kind of identifiable status quo. Dark City's society lacks any kind of distinct cultural identity beyond just kind of looking like a movie version of 1945 that's meant to be a giant test tube, essentially. I guess there's a certain naivete to how the characters act, but that's more of a generic sensibility of the era. Beyond the snippets of interactions with minor characters, all you get is a broad sense that people just wake up and fall asleep at their due times, that they're largely puppets. Yes, you see a few people doing their jobs and like one couple talking over dinner, but that's kind of it. The only side character who seems to be fleshed out and given more depth than whatever one-dimensional role the strangers assign to them is May, the woman who solicits John at the automat. It was also a missed opportunity not to spend more time with her daughter. How do children perceive this false reality? Really, the script needed more information and time spent regarding the mechanics behind the stranger's puppetry. Show us more of the trial and error, a few more scenarios of meddling. Show us why they picked or kept the humans in this particular depressing noir setting. Why did they abduct white urbanite Americans in 1948? The Matrix could afford to gloss over this because the real world was such a stark contrast to the permanent late 90s of the Matrix simulation. And also because you could easily picture what the rest of the world beyond Thomas Anderson's bland urban landscape probably looked like. Going back to The Crow, in just the first 10 minutes alone, it conveys its atmosphere as a heavy metal gothic hellscape where crime is basically the status quo. And every year, everyone loses their mind during Hell Night. We learn that mythology about reincarnation is popularly believed, or at least believed by most of the people, believed by most of the characters we interact with. We see how the side characters feel about the world they inhabit. We see the relationship between locals and law enforcement. We get character building moments with Sergeant Albrecht, Sarah's mom, Mickey the hot dog guy, Top Dollar's henchman. You just overall very quickly get a sense that this is a brutal town where superstition and spirituality are heightened. It creates a nest and a playground in which an emo clown demon man running around seeking revenge feels perfectly normal to the world. John Murdoch, unfortunately, just isn't that interesting as a lead character. Neither he nor the world he inhabits really do much to complement or contrast with one another. In The Matrix, Thomas Anderson, aka Neo, had to be coaxed into leaving his dreary unreality, and then takes the final steps of his own volition after learning of the consequences and responsibilities of that. After learning of what the consequences and responsibilities of that decision will mean going forward, John is just kind of thrust into the role of the one. There's not much of a transition at all between former life and savior. Yeah, he also needs some encouragement from Dr. Schreiber to reach his full potential, but he's mostly just skeptical of this reality from the start. It takes a little bit to get him going fully against the system, but he really just wakes up one day as a total fish out of water, desperately trying to scramble out of the bowl. Schreiber is there to drip feed him exposition and then finally stabs him in the head with a syringe that makes him learn kung fu. The Matrix made Neo's leveling up feel cool. Morpheus was there as a pseudo-spiritual guide, empowering his escape, and the martial arts aspect provided a visual analog for the consciousness expansion. Neo has several stages of growth. John Murdoch is just kind of binary. He's in, and then he's out. In either version of Dark City, it feels to me like there's 30 minutes missing. Most fantasy hero arcs need a training montage. Not a literal training montage, but the Luke on Dagobah segment. some time spent away going through a kind of side quest or trials. John Murdoch sort of goes through this when he visits his uncle at the old aquarium, but it's largely for narrative exposition purposes. Most of the impact of John's transformation as a character is lost because it's smashed into the end of the film, when a suddenly mentorish Dr. Schreiber gives him a lifetime of teaching in 15 seconds via syringe. Neo's I know kung fu moment occurred early in the film and was just a taste of what was to come. It wasn't a, here's all the power, now go win. It was to demonstrate to Neo how limited his worldview was up until that point, and largely how arbitrary power attainment is, which feeds into the sinisterness of the agents. Like, if you can just download badass martial arts skills, then what chance really do you have against an antagonist that is permanently inside the space that gave you said powers? And in Dark City, the ground rules aren't laid out in a way that delineates or differentiates the stranger's powers versus John's. It's just established that they're exactly the same, and it kills a lot of the conflict because there are no real complications. Yeah, Neo becomes a kung fu master, but he still gets his ass kicked by Smith. So I guess for me, the problem is kind of vague and all-encompassing. Dark City feels neither here nor there stylistically. The main character needed to be either more nuanced or weirder and generally more entertaining. The film as a whole needed to either lean in harder to the subtler aspects of moody psychological noir, or needed to embrace the odd premise and just do more weird stuff with it. It's a fine movie, but it is just fine to me. The general premise would lead one to believe that it's more niche and bizarre than what it actually is, and it's just mostly a safe, middling sci-fi fantasy film. It doesn't do anything better than any of its nearest neighbors, and it doesn't take any swings wild enough to tickle the whimsy part of my brain. It's a roadmap to like 5 or so other better ideas. I'm glad it exists. I wish there were more original movies like it today, but for what it is, it just doesn't do it for me. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and have a wonderful day.